While every settler in Cane Creek Valley rushed to stack cordwood against their cabin walls before the first frost, Norwegian immigrant Erik Thorvald was still digging into the mountainside in late September. His neighbors called it foolish labor. They called him touched in the head. Thorvald had excavated a 40-foot trench directly into the slope behind his building site, creating what appeared to be a useless cave that consumed weeks of backbreaking work. He positioned his cabin foundation so that the rear third of the structure would sit embedded in the hillside itself, with only the front portion rising above ground level like a normal dwelling. Marcus Jennings, the valley's most prosperous farmer who owned 200 acres of prime bottomland, rode past Thorvald's construction site, shaking his head in disbelief. "Man's building himself a groundhog hole instead of a proper cabin," Jennings announced at the general store that evening. "Norwegians must live in caves back in their country." William Tacket, who had survived 28 winters in these mountains and considered himself the authority on Blue Ridge construction, dismissed Thorvald's design as Northern European madness, unsuited to Appalachian conditions. "Ground stays wet in these hills," Tacket warned anyone who would listen. "That cabin will rot from the bottom up inside 3 years. Mark my words." Then December 1871 brought the first test, followed by the catastrophic winter of 1872 that would trap the valley under snow for 67 consecutive days. Families burned furniture, fence rails, and barn siding to stay alive. Jennings lost 14 head of cattle when he couldn't reach his hay stores through 8-foot drifts. Tackett's family nearly froze when their woodpile became an ice-locked mountain they couldn't penetrate. But Thorvald's strange half-buried cabin, the one neighbors had mocked as a groundhog hole, maintained comfortable temperatures using wood he accessed through an interior passage that never saw snow, never felt wind, and never froze solid. His underground storage chamber held 47 cords of perfectly dry firewood that remained accessible when every above-ground woodpile in the valley became useless. What did this Norwegian carpenter understand about underground storage and earth-sheltered construction that experienced mountain settlers had completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Erik Thorvald stood waist-deep in the trench he'd been excavating for 3 weeks, his pickaxe striking the red clay and shale mixture that characterized this particular elevation of the Blue Ridge. The September sun still carried warmth, but Thorvald knew from 32 years of Norwegian winters that the pleasant weather was a lie, a brief pause before the mountains revealed their true nature. Behind him, the sound of hoofbeats announced another visitor to his peculiar construction site. Thorvald didn't turn around. He'd grown accustomed to the daily parade of curious neighbors who came to witness what they considered spectacular foolishness. "Erik, I've come to talk sense into you before it's too late," called out William Tacket, dismounting from his gray mare with the stiff movements of a man who'd spent nearly 6 decades in these mountains. Tacket had built 23 cabins across 3 counties since arriving from Virginia in 1843, and he considered himself the final authority on proper mountain construction. Thorvald climbed out of his excavation, brushing clay from his wool trousers. The Norwegian stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with forearms thickened by 15 years of ship carpentry before he'd immigrated to America. His English carried the melodic accent of his homeland, though he'd learned the language well enough during his years working the timber trade between Bergen and British ports. "You dig yourself into trouble," Tacket continued, gesturing at the 40-foot trench that extended into the hillside at a precise 12-degree downward angle. "Ground holds water in these hills. Come spring, You'll have a river running through your living quarters. I've seen it happen to men who built too close to slopes." Thorvald wiped sweat from his forehead and studied the older man with patience, born from hearing similar warnings daily for 3 weeks. "In Hardanger, we build into mountains for 800 years, he replied calmly. "Water runs downhill, yes? I dig with slope, not against. Water finds lower ground, not my floor." The technical explanation meant nothing to Tacket, who had never encountered earth-sheltered construction and couldn't imagine why anyone would deliberately bury a portion of their home. American frontier logic demanded maximum separation between dwelling and ground, raising cabins on stone foundations to prevent rot, moisture intrusion, and vermin access. Thorvald's approach violated every principle Tacket had learned through decades of mountain building experience. "You're wasting good labor," Tacket insisted. "That digging time should go towards stacking firewood. Winter comes fast in these mountains, and a man needs 20 cords minimum to see his family through to spring. You'll freeze trying to heat a groundhog den." Thorvald allowed himself a slight smile, the first sign of emotion he'd shown during the exchange. "I stack firewood inside the mountain," he said, pointing toward the excavation. 47 cords, dry and warm, never touched by snow or ice. When your wood pile freezes solid and you cannot split logs with axe, I walk through door and carry armload back to fire. Tacket stared at the Norwegian as if he'd proposed building his cabin on the moon. The concept of interior firewood storage on such a scale simply didn't exist in Appalachian building tradition. Mountain settlers stacked cordwood outside their cabins, typically against the structure's north wall where afternoon sun wouldn't accelerate decay. The idea of excavating a massive underground chamber, specifically for fuel storage, represented such a departure from established practice that Tacket couldn't process it as a legitimate construction strategy. "You'll rot that wood storing it in damp ground," Tacket finally managed. "Firewood needs air circulation, needs to dry proper. Underground storage is no better than throwing good timber in a creek." "Earth stays 55 degrees always," Thorvald explained, describing thermal principles his ancestors had discovered through centuries of survival in Norway's brutal climate. "Winter cold cannot reach below frostline. Summer heat cannot reach below frostline. Wood stored in earth dries slow but steady, never freezes, never rots if drainage is proper. In Hardanger, we store food, wood, and supplies for years without loss." The technical sophistication of Norwegian earth-sheltered construction had evolved through 800 years of adaptation to one of Europe's most challenging climates. Thorvald's ancestors had learned that underground storage eliminated the freeze-thaw cycles that damaged above-ground supplies, maintained consistent temperatures that prevented the moisture fluctuations causing rot, and provided protection from the heavy snows that could bury surface storage for months at a time. These principles, refined through generations of harsh necessity, seemed like primitive cave dwelling to American settlers who had never experienced conditions severe enough to demand such solutions. Marcus Jennings arrived later that afternoon, his fine Virginia-bred horse picking carefully across the construction debris scattered around Thorvald's site. Jennings owned the most prosperous farm in Cane Creek Valley, having accumulated 200 acres through a combination of shrewd land purchases and profitable corn cultivation. His success had established him as the unofficial leader of the valley's social hierarchy, a position he exercised through constant commentary on his neighbors' decisions. "Tacket tells me you're digging a cave to live in," Jennings called out, not bothering to dismount. His tone carried the condescension of a successful man addressing someone he considered fundamentally misguided. "I've seen desperate men do strange things," but this beats all I've witnessed in 15 years of mountain living. Thorvald continued laying the foundation stones for his cabin's front wall, positioning each piece with the precision of a craftsman who had learned his trade building fishing vessels designed to survive North Sea storms. The Norwegian had purchased 80 acres of hillside land that Jennings had dismissed as unsuitable for cultivation, paying a quarter of the price per acre that bottomland commanded. What Jennings saw as worthless slope, Thorvald recognized as the perfect site for earth-sheltered construction. Cave keeps man alive when cabin fails, Thorvald replied without looking up from his work. Norwegian winter teaches this truth. I think Appalachian winter will teach same lesson someday. Jennings laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the valley. These mountains have nothing on Norway's cold, I'm sure, he said mockingly. But we've survived just fine with proper American construction for generations. Don't need foreign methods that belong in the old country. The exchange attracted several other settlers who had paused their own autumn preparations to witness the ongoing confrontation between the strange Norwegian and the valley's established authorities. Thomas Hartley, a 40-year-old farmer whose land bordered Thorvald's property, watched the construction with more curiosity than criticism. Hartley had noticed something the others had missed: the precise angles of Thorvald's excavation, the careful drainage channels cut into the trench floor, and the methodical way the Norwegian tested soil composition at different depths. Whatever Thorvald was building, it wasn't the product of ignorance or madness. It was the execution of a detailed plan that Hartley couldn't fully understand, but recognized as intentional engineering. By early October, Thorvald's construction had progressed enough to reveal his complete design, and the site drew daily crowds of skeptical observers. The cabin measured 24 feet wide by 36 feet long, with the front 24 feet rising conventionally above ground on a stone foundation. But the rear 12 feet of the structure extended directly into the excavated hillside, with the cabin's back wall formed by the mountain itself. A heavy timber door in the cabin's rear interior wall opened into the underground storage chamber Thorvald had excavated over the previous month. This chamber extended 40 feet into the hillside with a ceiling height of 8 feet and a width of 16 feet. The space could hold over 50 cords of firewood stacked floor to ceiling, more fuel than most families burned in 2 full winters. Thorvald had lined the chamber floor with flat stones laid over a 6-inch gravel drainage bed, ensuring that any water intrusion would flow toward a channel he'd cut along the chamber's lowest edge. This drainage channel exited through a small tunnel that emerged 30 feet downslope from the cabin, carrying away moisture before it could accumulate. Man's built himself a root cellar the size of a barn, Tacket observed during one of his daily inspection visits. Still say it'll flood come spring. That hillside holds water like a sponge, and all that wood will rot before he can burn it. But Thomas Hartley had begun keeping detailed notes on Thorvald's construction, recording measurements, materials, and techniques that seemed unlike anything he'd encountered in American building tradition. Hartley had worked as a surveyor before the war and retained the habit of documenting interesting observations. Something about the Norwegians' systematic approach suggested knowledge rather than guesswork, and Hartley wanted to understand the principles behind the peculiar design. The rear wall stays cool, to the touch even in afternoon heat, Hartley mentioned to his wife Elizabeth that evening. Ground temperature must be lower than air temperature, and that could mean the opposite holds true in winter. If the earth holds warmth when air turns cold, Thorvald's cabin might stay warmer than ours with less fire. Elizabeth Hartley, practical and skeptical in equal measure, reminded her husband that speculation meant nothing compared to observed results. "Let's see how that groundhog hole performs when real winter arrives," she suggested. "If the Norwegian freezes, we'll know his methods don't work here. If he stays warm, maybe there's something to learn." November brought the first serious frost, coating the valley in ice crystals that transformed the landscape into a crystalline wonderland. Thorvald had completed his cabin construction and begun the process that his neighbors found most baffling: stacking cordwood inside his underground chamber rather than against his exterior walls. Each day, the Norwegian hauled split oak and hickory into the hillside, arranging the pieces with deliberate spacing that allowed air circulation while maximizing storage capacity. He positioned the driest wood nearest the chamber entrance, where it would be accessed first, while newer cut timber went toward the back where earth temperatures would cure it slowly over the coming months. "That wood will never dry proper in a cave," William Tacket declared, repeating his prediction to anyone who would listen. "Come February, he'll be trying to burn wet logs that smoke more than they heat. Man's condemned himself to a miserable winter through stubborn foreign thinking." But Thorvald understood thermal dynamics that Tacket had never needed to learn. The underground chamber maintained a constant temperature of approximately 54 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of exterior conditions, a phenomenon his ancestors had discovered centuries ago, and modern geologists would later confirm as the stable temperature below the frost line in temperate climates. This consistent warmth created ideal curing conditions for firewood, removing moisture slowly without the rapid drying that caused surface cracking or the freezing that trapped moisture inside the wood fibers. By early December, Thorvald's underground chamber held 47 cords of firewood, enough fuel to heat his cabin for 3 full winters at typical consumption rates. The wood nearest the chamber entrance had cured to optimal burning moisture content during its weeks of underground storage, while newer additions continued the slow drying process that would prepare them for future use. The entire supply remained accessible through a single interior door, protected from snow, ice, wind, and the freeze-thaw cycles that would plague every above-ground woodpile in the valley. December 1871 brought the first test of Thorvald's unconventional system, and the results began separating theory from performance in ways that impressed even skeptical observers. A week-long cold snap dropped temperatures to 5 degrees below zero, freezing exposed water sources and coating every surface with ice. Settlers across Cane Creek Valley struggled to access their woodpiles, which had become ice-locked masses, requiring hours of chipping and prying to extract enough fuel for a day's heating. Thomas Hartley visited Thorvald's cabin on December 15th, ostensibly to discuss a property boundary question, but actually to observe the Norwegian's heating system in operation. What he found challenged everything he'd assumed about proper mountain construction. The cabin's interior maintained a comfortable temperature that Hartley estimated at 65 degrees, achieved with a modest fire that consumed perhaps half the fuel Hartley's own fireplace required for similar warmth. More remarkably, the rear portion of the cabin, the section embedded in the hillside, radiated a gentle warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The earth itself seemed to be heating the structure, providing baseline warmth that the fireplace merely supplemented. "Ground holds heat from summer," Thorvald explained, demonstrating the phenomenon by having Hartley place his hand against the rear wall. The stone and packed earth surface felt noticeably warmer than the exterior-facing walls, despite receiving no direct heating. In winter, earth gives back warmth it stored. In summer, earth stays cool when air turns hot. Mountain becomes part of house, helps with heating and cooling both. Hartley filed his observations away for future reference. Something significant was happening at Thorvald's hillside property, something that might matter greatly if winter turned severe. January 1872 arrived with ominous weather patterns that experienced mountain residents recognized as dangerous. Jonathan Morse, a 67-year-old hunter who had ranged these mountains since before the war, studied the sky with growing concern. "Clouds are stacking wrong," Morse announced at the general store on January 3rd. "Pressure feels like it did before the killing winter of '57. We might be in for trouble nobody's prepared for." Morse's weather instincts, honed through 5 decades of mountain living, proved devastatingly accurate. On January 8, 1872, the first of what would become 11 major snowstorms began depositing accumulation that would eventually exceed 14 feet in the valley's higher elevations. The snow fell steadily for 67 consecutive days, with only brief pauses between storms that allowed residents barely enough time to assess damage before the next system arrived. By January 20th, the crisis had become unmistakable. Woodpiles that settlers had stacked against their cabin walls disappeared under snowdrifts that reached roof height in exposed locations. Families who had prepared what they considered adequate fuel supplies found their cordwood frozen solid, encased in ice that required exhausting labor to penetrate. The freeze-thaw cycles typical of Appalachian winters had created alternating layers of ice and snow that turned woodpiles into impenetrable blocks, each layer of meltwater refreezing into armor that defeated axes and pry bars. Marcus Jennings, whose 200-acre prosperity had always insulated him from hardship, faced a crisis that money couldn't solve. His 30-cord woodpile had become an ice mountain that his farmhands couldn't crack despite working in shifts around the clock. The Jennings family began burning fence rails on January 25th, sacrificing infrastructure that had taken years to build in exchange for temporary warmth. By February 1st, they had started on the furniture, dismantling a mahogany dining set that had cost Jennings 3 months' income to import from Richmond. William Tacket's situation deteriorated even faster. The 60-year-old builder had stacked his firewood according to 28 years of mountain experience, positioning 22 cords against his cabin's north wall where tradition said they belonged. But the unprecedented snow accumulation had buried his entire supply under a 10-foot drift that froze solid during the first week of storms. Tacket and his son spent 3 days tunneling toward their woodpile, finally reaching frozen logs that wouldn't burn properly and produced more smoke than heat. By February 10th, the Tacket family had burned their barn siding and were considering the structural timbers of their storage shed. Thomas Hartley remembered his observations at Thorvald's cabin and made the difficult trek across the snow-covered valley on February 3rd. What he found astonished him. The Norwegian's strange, half-buried cabin showed a thin plume of wood smoke rising efficiently from the chimney, a sign of proper combustion using dry, well-cured fuel. The earth-sheltered rear section of the structure had prevented snow from accumulating against the back wall, while the embedded design meant that Thorvald's firewood storage remained completely accessible regardless of exterior conditions. "Come inside," Thorvald invited, opening his door to reveal an interior warm enough that Hartley's frozen clothing began dripping immediately. The cabin maintained temperatures that Hartley estimated at 62 degrees, achieved with a fire so modest that it seemed inadequate for the brutal conditions outside. But the thermal mass of the surrounding hillside continued contributing baseline warmth that supplemented the fire's output, creating comfortable living conditions that required perhaps 40% less fuel than conventional above-ground construction. "My wood stays dry inside mountain," Thorvald explained, leading Hartley through the interior door to his underground storage chamber. The sight that greeted Hartley represented the difference between survival and catastrophe. 43 cords of split hardwood remained stacked floor to ceiling, perfectly dry and unfrozen, accessible through an interior passage that had never felt wind or seen snow. The chamber temperature held steady at 54 degrees, warm enough to prevent freezing, but cool enough to preserve the wood indefinitely. I burn 1.5 cords each week, Thorvald continued, demonstrating the mathematics that his design made possible. Chamber holds fuel for 28 weeks of heating at current rate. Winter cannot last so long, so I cannot run out of wood. When neighbors' piles freeze solid, I walk 20 feet through warm passage and carry back armload of dry fuel. Hartley understood immediately that Thorvald's system represented fundamental engineering superiority over traditional mountain construction. The Norwegian hadn't just built a cabin. He'd built an integrated survival system that eliminated the vulnerabilities plaguing every other family in the valley. While his neighbors fought desperately to access frozen wood piles buried under snowdrifts, Thorvald simply opened an interior door and helped himself to perfectly stored fuel. News of Thorvald's situation spread through the struggling community with the speed of desperate hope. By February 10th, a delegation including Marcus Jennings, William Tacket, and 6 other valley patriarchs arrived at the Norwegian's cabin to request assistance. The same men who had mocked Thorvald's construction as groundhog dwelling now stood in his comfortable living space, hats in hand, asking for help. "We've come to buy firewood," Jennings announced, his previous condescension replaced by the humility that crisis demanded. "Name your price. I'll pay whatever you ask." Thorvald studied the delegation with an expression that mixed compassion with something harder. Perhaps the memory of months spent enduring ridicule for construction methods these men had dismissed as foreign foolishness. But Norwegian tradition valued community survival over individual vindication, and Thorvald had built his system with capacity far exceeding his own needs. "I do not sell wood," Thorvald replied, watching hope drain from the faces before him. "I give wood to neighbors who need it. This is what we do in Hardanger. Mountain people help mountain people survive." Over the following weeks, Thorvald's underground chamber became the valley's fuel supply, distributing firewood to families who had exhausted their accessible stores. The Norwegian rationed his reserves carefully, providing each family enough fuel to maintain life-sustaining heat while preserving supplies for the duration of the crisis. His 47-cord stockpile, mocked as excessive when he'd assembled it, proved barely adequate to supplement the entire community's failed heating preparations. Thorvald used the crisis as an opportunity to educate neighbors about the principles behind his construction. He led interested settlers through his underground chamber, explaining drainage techniques that prevented moisture accumulation, demonstrating how earth temperature remained constant regardless of exterior conditions, and showing how interior access eliminated the fundamental vulnerability of surface storage. "Your wood piles fail because they face weather," Thorvald explained to William Tacket, who had spent 28 years building according to methods that this winter had proven inadequate. "Snow buries them. Ice freezes them. Water rots them. My wood never sees weather after I stack it. Chamber stays same temperature always, same humidity always. Wood dries slow and perfect, ready to burn whenever I need it." Tacket's professional pride, already damaged by weeks of crisis, suffered a final blow as he recognized the sophistication of Thorvald's supposedly primitive design. The Norwegian hadn't just dug a cave. He'd engineered a storage system that solved problems Tacket had never even identified: drainage, temperature stability, humidity control, accessibility. These factors had never entered Tacket's construction calculations because American frontier building simply didn't account for conditions severe enough to require such solutions. "I've built 23 cabins in these mountains," Tacket admitted to Thorvald on February 15th, his voice carrying the weight of reconsidered certainty. "Never lost a family to cold. But this winter would have killed us all if not for your supplies. Maybe Norwegian methods know something about surviving that I never learned." The crisis continued through early March, with the final significant snowfall arriving on March 11th. By the time the accumulated snow began melting, 67 consecutive days of winter accumulation had tested every assumption about proper mountain construction. The results told an undeniable story. Traditional American frontier building methods had failed catastrophically under conditions that Norwegian earth-sheltered design handled routinely. 3 families had abandoned their cabins entirely when heating system failures made the structures uninhabitable. 14 head of cattle died across the valley when fodder stores became inaccessible under snowdrifts. Marcus Jennings calculated his losses from burned fencing, furniture, and barn materials at over $400, a staggering sum that represented 2 years of agricultural profit. William Tacket's storage shed, sacrificed for heating fuel, would require an entire summer to rebuild. Thorvald's half-buried cabin emerged from winter with 11 cords of firewood remaining in its underground chamber, enough fuel to heat the structure for another 7 weeks if conditions had required it. The earth-sheltered design had proven its fundamental advantages under the most severe test the valley had experienced in living memory. Spring 1872 brought reconstruction efforts across Cane Creek Valley, and with them came requests for Thorvald to share his construction knowledge. Thomas Hartley, whose surveyor's training made him valuable in community planning projects, began documenting the Norwegians' building techniques in detail. The resulting manuscript, preserved in the Western North Carolina Historical Archives, provides the most complete record of early, earth-sheltered construction in the Appalachian region. Marcus Jennings, whose prosperity had collapsed during the crisis, contracted Thorvald to design earth-sheltered storage facilities for his rebuilt farm. The project included underground chambers for hay, grain, root vegetables, and firewood, creating the integrated food and fuel security that had allowed Thorvald to survive when Jennings's above-ground systems failed. The investment represented Jennings's acknowledgement that wealth meant nothing without the practical knowledge to protect it. The construction projects provided Thorvald with income that transformed his position in valley society. The strange Norwegian, who had dug himself a groundhog hole, became the respected authority on winter survival preparation, consulted on building projects across 3 counties. His earth-sheltered designs spread through Appalachian communities connected by mountain roads and shared hardship, adapting Norwegian survival techniques to American frontier conditions. By 1880, 23 cabins within 50 miles of Cane Creek Valley incorporated some element of Thorvald's underground storage design. The most elaborate installations featured multiple chambers for different storage purposes, accessible through interior passages that remained usable regardless of weather. Simpler versions added single underground rooms to existing structures, providing protected firewood storage that eliminated the most critical vulnerability of conventional construction. Regional firewood consumption dropped 25% in communities that adopted underground storage, reflecting both improved curing conditions and reduced waste from weather damage. Thorvald's son, Anders, maintained detailed records of storage chamber performance, donating them to the University of North Carolina in 1923. where modern building scientists would use them to validate earth-sheltered construction principles. The technique's regional legacy crystallized through the establishment of the Blue Ridge Earth-Sheltered Building Association in 1889, founded by Thomas Hartley's son, James, using his father's documentation of Thorvald's methods. The association published construction guides that translated Norwegian knowledge into practical instructions for American builders, complete with specifications adapted to local soil conditions, climate patterns, and available materials. Modern geological research, conducted by Appalachian State University in 1984, confirmed the thermal stability principles that Thorvald had understood intuitively. Research teams installed temperature sensors at various depths around surviving earth-sheltered structures from the 1870s, documenting that underground chambers maintained temperatures between 52 and 56 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of surface conditions. This stable environment created optimal storage conditions for firewood, food supplies, and other materials vulnerable to temperature extremes. Archaeological preservation efforts at Thorvald's original Cane Creek Valley site began in 1976 when the property was purchased by the Blue Ridge Historical Society. The original cabin and underground storage chamber remain largely intact, allowing visitors to examine construction techniques that modern builders recognize as sophisticated environmental engineering. The site represents one of the earliest documented examples of Norwegian, earth-sheltered construction adapted to American conditions. Contemporary sustainable building practices employ thermal mass and earth-sheltering principles identical to those Thorvald applied in 1871. Positioning storage and living spaces partially underground to tap the Earth's temperature-moderating properties, designing drainage systems that prevent moisture intrusion while maintaining stable humidity, and creating interior access passages that eliminate weather vulnerability. These techniques, dismissed as primitive by Thorvald's contemporaries, anticipated by over a century the energy-conscious building methods that modern architects consider advanced environmental design. The ultimate vindication of Thorvald's underground storage system came through survival statistics that demonstrated the life-saving value of traditional knowledge applied to extreme conditions. The winter of 1872 killed 47 people across 4 North Carolina mountain counties due to inadequate heating and fuel exhaustion. But families with earth-sheltered storage, whether Thorvald's original design or the copies that began appearing after his system's success became known, suffered no cold-related casualties despite experiencing identical weather conditions. The mathematics told a story that pride and tradition had prevented valley settlers from understanding before crisis forced revelation. Underground storage maintained consistent temperatures that prevented fuel degradation. Interior access eliminated weather vulnerability that trapped surface supplies under snow and ice. Thermal mass from surrounding Earth provided baseline heating that reduced fuel consumption by 35 to 45% compared to conventional above-ground construction. Thorvald's strange half-buried cabin hadn't just challenged mountain-building assumptions. It had proven that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often revealed not their ignorance but ours.